First and foremost, I would like to acknowledge my humble gratitude for the ancestors of this land and the community to have the opportunity to share knowledge, and for those that have set the path for us to have this opportunity to be here. And I'm just going to give my little brief blurb about Dr. Daniel Wildcat. One of the reasons why I completed my PhD was that he was always that person telling me in the background, figure it out. Are you going to let them control you, or are you going to try to change the world one section at a time? So although there's been many before us that have paved the way, I really want to acknowledge the mentorship of Vine Deloria of Wildcat, and now us here in the panel before us are actually that next generation who really wants to take that torch and move it forward, and hopefully we'll do them right. So my talk today is really about Indigenous research ethics, but from a concept of the masculine narrative that has taken place in regards to environmental ethics. And from that context, it really comes from that settler colonialist language, meaning that the intersectionalities of gender have often been left out. And we must remind ourselves, as the gentleman reminded us today, that many of the laws and policies state the word men or man. And often the other components of all the different ways we identify in our communities are erased or are being erased. So from my background, I have really been focusing on Indigenous ethics for some time now. I wear multiple hats. And part of the essence of my work is infused with critical race theory, which actually states that racism is endemic in society. The other component of my base is tribal critical race theory, which states that the colonization of our societies didn't happen, it's still happening, and it's endemic. So from that point, I'd like to state that when we talk about Indigenous research ethics, we're always those groups of people who would like to co-opt our knowledges. People come in to tell us the ways in which we used to live versus the ways in which we live now. And so one of the ways that I want to advance the agendas that have been laid out for me is really to talk about what does it mean to decolonize the concept of reciprocity. So my focus has moved forward to really unpack the meanings of traditional knowledge as an active participant, nature as an active participant. So we have a lot of people who really talk about the rights of nature, but I don't hear a lot of context where the environment is actually an active participant. And it is always an active participant. Just like the intersectionalities of genders are always an active participant, and they're often erased in these very monologued conversations. And so when we talk about traditional knowledge and nature as an active participant, we must also talk about that as a bidirectional exchange. We are of our natural environment. A lot of us can say that they're part of their creation stories. We treat our natural environment as a relative. It is a who and not an it. And so therefore, when we talk about what does it mean to decolonize the word in regards to environmental ethics, Indigenous reciprocity, what does that mean? And I would say it would have different meanings based on that geospatial context of identity. So we know that as Indigenous peoples, we are often displaced. It's an ongoing process of displacement. We also know that because of those displacements, our identities are not static, they're fluid, because we also have to navigate two worlds. We have the world in which our blood runs strong, and we can state very, very clearly that we are the descendants that they could not erase. And then we have to navigate another society, which is very contemporary, that still uses the context of men and man when they have these very singular conversations in regards to the environment. So part of that is also acknowledging how do we reclaim the identity of that spirituality, that vibration, that connection to that natural world, to that natural environment. When we have so many energies around us that it's hard to focus on one thing at one time. We are in a technology era. And many of us can say in the audience that we're constantly often checking our gadgets. We're using our gadgets to navigate. We're using our gadgets to even communicate, which makes a very strong statement about what is the connect and disconnect in regards to viewing nature as an active participant versus being something that is dissected and observed. So in my new journey, we all go through times in our lives where we have these epiphanies, and I've been a part of hosting community conversations since 2015, really wanting to set a stage for tribal college students, alumni from tribal colleges, and showcasing what they do on their campuses, but also changing the narrative. Because it's time that we change the narrative. And we can see that that narrative is slowly changing, but in my opinion, not fast enough. So we're still having some of the same conversations that a mentor that I respect as an uncle, but I also respect him as an educator, Dr. Daniel Wildcat, has said, we have an urgent responsibility. And we're still unpacking what that urgent responsibility is. So my new journey, I've been asking myself and others around me, how we continue to redefine climate refugee, to acknowledge that nature is an active participant. We also have to ask ourselves, what is the geospatial reciprocity as it relates to identity of indigenous people? So if we're constantly being refugees of our knowledge, of our place, of the natural world in which we're made of, how do we address those issues? But even more so, how do we address them in a language that is not colonized or from a masculine narrative that again excludes the intersectionalities of genders? How do we do that? But most importantly, how do we redefine property law versus natural law? And we can say that each nation has their own laws in which we view our relatives. How do we reset the time and go back to that? So in an essence, when we're really talking about critical race theory, that racism is endemic, and we're talking about tribal critical race theory where colonization is endemic, how do we then get back to that notion of acknowledging that nature is an active participant in everything we do? As a mentor and uncle who would say, Kalani from Hawaii, you know, the first thing that we do when we come into this world is we inhale. That air is part of that relationship. The last thing that we do when we take our journey is we exhale. And that natural world is then embracing us for what journey is next for us, which is quite powerful when you really think of it from that context. So when you think about that masculine narrative, the masculine narrative is about property law. It's about owning bodies. It's about ownership of ideas. And when you think of research within institutions, it's about a time clock. It's about how can we co-opt knowledge to rechange the knowledge so that we can tell you what your stories are. How do we change the masculine narrative? Now, I'm not sitting here to be disrespectful and say that I'm bashing masculinity whatsoever. But we know in our cultural beliefs that we walk together. And it's not that women and children are meant to be seen and not heard, or those within those cross spaces of intersectionality. So when we start talking about what does it mean to have racism and colonization endemic in our societies, it means that we must acknowledge that the narrative has to be changed. We must acknowledge that nature is an active participant. Nature is a who, not an it. So when we think of the trees, and we think of everything around us, the trees as our relatives, the root systems of the trees have the best gossip hotline on earth. The best gossip hotline. And if people can say, oh, I'm having a bad day, I need to go for a walk. I need to go walk by the water. I need to go for a swim. It's because nature is interacting with you to give you exactly the right amount of medicine you need to recalibrate your vibrations, to acknowledge that she is an active participant in everything you do from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep. So how do we decolonize the act of decolonizing? How do we decolonize the act of participation? And how do we embrace that conversations aren't meant to throw stones, they're meant to call people in. And in order to heal from the residential and boarding school era, we have to look at that indigenized reciprocity. We have to look at what does it mean to participate. And the beauty of having such strong spaces such as today to speak freely and know that through this voice, I'm not being colonized. I'm actually decolonizing the narrative of the colonizer. So when we go back to that whole context of redefining a climate refugee, we must also think about, from an environmental ethics perspective, how do we acknowledge that the natural world around us is also a refugee, not just human bodies, not just our four-legged relative, the wing, the two-legged. How do we acknowledge the heartbeat of nature as an active participant is too a climate refugee? We know the Arctic ice is melting at a rapid rate. We know that the city of Seattle recently released 236 million gallons of sewage into our waters. In a 3-period cycle, 30 million gallons of that raw sewage was only filtered for plastics. We know last year we hit a height temperature in regards to forest fires. So if someone tells me that nature is an active participant, I need you to give me proof, because nature's being violated. It's being disrespected. So if we don't decolonize the way in which we're decolonizing our conversations, that is to call people into the conversation, not call them out, then we're going to keep having these same conversations year after year, but we're going to keep erasing ourselves. So if you've erased the narrative that nature isn't an active participant, you erase yourselves. You erase your creation stories, and you erase the little ones that are walking around in here today. That's why we do it. To honor our elders, to honor this sacred space. Because in most Western institutions, this conversation isn't a safe conversation to have. It's a conversation that creates pushback versus viewing it as a welcome conversation. So as I end, I know I'm going pretty fast, but as I end what I have to say, I ask all of you to take the journey with me, to acknowledge the conversation from the rights of nature but to the conversation of nature as an active participant. Because when you say nature has a right, my question would be, then who decides what that right is? When will that policy be enacted and how will it be changed? We know that every day there's a constant erasure and change of policy based on capitalism, right? We can say that all of this is happening at such an alarming rate. So I ask you to take the quest with me, that when you have the conversations about the rights of nature, that you be inclusive to make the major point to be that nature is an active participant. Thank you.